Hi, good morning, everyone. Let me just say at first, it is a pleasure to be here in Hyderabad, in India, and I would like to thank very much the IAMCR for this very kind invitation to be able to spend those days with you, interacting and having this opportunity to talk a little bit about this experience that we are having in Brazil on the Internet Bill of Rights for the Brazilian Internet. It's a federal law that has been approved earlier this year after more than 5 years of negotiations, of comings and goings in the National Congress. And I think it's a case that we could suggest as an example to the broad discussions that we are raising in this panel in this morning. So let me just start telling you about 3 topics on this Internet Bill of Law for Bill of Rights for Brazil. So I'll begin speaking about the origin of this initiative, and I'll then speak about the rights or the contents of this legislation, and I will end talking a little bit about what's next. So what's the future for this legislation and what will coming up in Brazil on internet governance and regulation. So in terms of origins, I really have to say, apart from the fact that my slides are slightly not formatted as I would like them to be, that the origin in Brazil was this idea that we had in our National Congress more than 20 bill of laws that deals with cybercrime. So we had in Brazil at the time, it was like 6 years ago, we didn't have any specific law on the internet, but it was looking like the very first law on the internet in Brazil would be a law about cybercrime. So we come up with this idea that it was important to have, before a cybercrime law in Brazil, a law that deals with principles, that deals with human rights, that could set the standards from which afterwards you could punish someone from an illicit behavior online. And because of that, because of those numerous initiatives in the National Congress to deal with cybercrime, became a campaign through the civil society that started in the civil society against those bill of laws, not to say that a cybercrime law is not needed, but to say that it's a matter of process, that first you need to affirm the rights, and then you need to deal with cybercrime, you need to deal with the source of punishment for those who commit conducts on the internet. And through this campaign, through the civil society, came up with this concept that we needed in Brazil a law that deals with internet freedom. And when we talk about internet freedom, as Sunil has just mentioned, internet freedom can be a very tricky concept, because internet freedom can mean for some people that the idea of having a law that regulates the internet could be something essentially wrong, because freedom is the absence of law. As soon as you have a legislation being passed, as soon as you have a legislation being enforced, you are no longer free. So the idea behind the concept of internet freedom that we tried to develop in this initiative was the idea that internet freedom, in this sense, is not the absence of law, but it's freedom that is protected because you have a law that is focusing on human rights, that is focusing on fundamental rights, and will guarantee that those rights are to be enforced on the internet as they are enforced outside the internet. So that was the whole idea. And this idea in Brazil has 2, I would say, inspirations. One, in international level. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have a hard time here with the other mic. So they have 2 inspirations. One internationally, another nationally. On international level, one source of inspiration was the Internet Bill of Rights Coalition that was created in the IGF back in 2006. So this dynamic coalition in the IGF, nowadays it's called Internet Rights and Principles, and it has created a charter and then a suggestion of 10 Internet Rights and Principles that is like widely available on the internet. And that was, I would say, one of the origins of this initiative that ended up being developed nationally in Brazil. And a second inspiration for the Marco Civil, for the Bill of Rights in Brazil, was the CGIBR, which stands for our Internet Steering Committee in Brazil, that had created the set of principles for Internet use and governance in Brazil. So they have their 10 principles as well. So bringing from those 2 inspirations, either internationally or nationally, we come up with the Marco Civil with the Internet Bill of Rights in Brazil, but it was created in a very unique way. And it was created through a website. that end up working just like your traditional internet forum. So if we were to be creating a law that we will be applying to the internet in Brazil, it wouldn't be a waste not to use the internet to get the inputs, to get the expertise of people who could contribute to the very creation of this law. So that's why we created this very simple website at the time. It was a partnership between the group that is now on the institute that I'm representing here, which is the ITS, the Institute for Technology and Society in Rio, and the Ministry of Justice of Brazil, in which we conducted this research through this website. It was a very simple website when people could discuss, debate on privacy, free speech, right to access, liability of internet service providers, net neutrality, governmental data, a bunch of questions. So this is what the website looked like. We end up running 2 rounds of consultations. In the first round of consultation, we just open up a website and say, please do inform us what topic would you like to see in this forthcoming legislation. And after we received those inputs, we opened up for a second round in which we suggested a first draft of this piece of legislation. And everyone could comment on the actual wording of the legislation, saying why they would want the legislation to be tweaked here and there, and why this certain provision is a good one or a bad one. So end up working just like an internet forum. And we end up receiving contributions from all over Brazil and in a very multi-stakeholder way, since we received contributions from civil society, technical community, from private sector, and the government ended up leading the whole process. And it was really interesting to mention the government contribution to this whole debate, because the Brazilian Foreign Affairs Ministry ended up sending out invitations to the embassies of Brazil located throughout the world to offer contributions to this initiative, saying how the internet is regulated in the country in which this embassy of Brazil is located. So we received contributions from all of those countries that end up creating in our platform, in our online platform of the Internet Bill of Rights for Brazil, a very interesting database of internet regulation, unfortunately written in Portuguese, but that would definitely created a great framework for us to deal with. So that was the initiative on the Marco Civil. As I said, 2 rounds of consultations, almost 2,000 contributions have been received, and the final draft was sent to Congress back in 2011. And then became a 3-year long stretch of the Marco Civil inside the Congress. We had the rapporteur, which is Alessandro Molon. That's a photo of the rapporteur of the Marco Civil. So the text that was created in the internet was sent to the Congress as a bill of law, and the Congress took 3 years analyzing the text, changing here and there the text. So the final result, of course, is far from perfect, but we end up having the legislation being approved by the Congress and signed by our president earlier this year during the Net Mundial event in April in São Paulo in Brazil. So now it's a law. So I have been working with the Marco Civil for more than 5 years now, so it was really a happy moment to see this initiative that was just an idea came to fruition and become an actual federal law. So that's the law of the Marco Civil. And just to make clear, folks, I'm talking about Marco Civil, which may seem a very strange expression for some of you. So that's why we're translating a civil rights framework for the Brazilian internet. But the Marco Civil is the name in Portuguese and end up creating some widespread attention on that. So that's why I keep telling you about the Marco Civil. So please pardon my Portuguese. But the whole idea with this law was create a set of principles and to deal with some specific rights. So I'm going through a couple of the provisions of the legislation, but I really go quickly here because I don't want to take the time of the other speakers of this panel. So the law has a couple of principles, such as the guarantee of freedom of speech, the privacy, the protection of personal data, the guarantee of net neutrality. And apart from principles, it had as well aims that it needs to promote, such as the right of all to access the internet, access to information, innovation, and the adoption of open technology standards. So this is all the aims of this, the goals of this legislation. And I want to go to a second part of my presentation, just very quickly to talk about the contents of the law itself, of the rights that are guaranteed through this legislation. So I'm going to talk about very quickly on 3 rights. First of all, privacy. And the Marco Civil was approved mostly because after the Snowden revelations, there was created in Brazil a certain commotion on the rights in the internet that ended up giving the Marco Civil a certain speed in the Congress. And the government really wanted the Marco Civil to be a response to the mass surveillance conducted by the US government and other governments. So there was this idea of having Marco Civil as an example piece of legislation that could be a response to the mass surveillance initiatives that were being disclosed by Edward Snowden at the time. I think it's important to mention that the president of Brazil herself has been spied on. So it was a very personal as well issue for Brazil to have the Marco Civil being sent out as an answer to the mass surveillance initiatives. So the Marco Civil deals with privacy in a number of provisions. I won't go through all provisions with you here, but I'm sure that nothing better in the morning than go through like a lawyer presenting articles of specific legislation. So I really go through all my boring slides full of texts on articles, on provisions of the law. But just to let you know that on privacy, we have a very strong protection of privacy in general terms. And when it comes to some issues that are quite interesting, just like the express consent of the person when the data is being treated, and the definitive deletion of personal data after someone decided to cancel the contract, to cancel their subscription in any like social network or any service that is handled in the internet. So apart from all those privacy provisions, I think it's important to mention that we have a quite strong net neutrality provision as well. And I'm quite sure that you are familiar with the concept of net neutrality. But if not, I think the idea behind net neutrality is the idea that you shouldn't treat the content that is delivered and is transmitted through the internet biased through standards of cultural, political, end up discriminating the content that is transmitted through the internet. And it's a very interesting concept that is not new, I might say, since back in the US in 1860, you had in the Telegraph Act something that is quite similar to our very own concept of net neutrality nowadays, as you can see here. But what we have in Brazil was the idea of not turning the internet into a cable TV of some sort. And this is a very widespread argument around net neutrality. The idea if net neutrality is not enforced, is not duly enforced, internet will become a second cable TV. So that's why we don't want the internet to be something like that you pay a subscription and then you pay like plus $5 to access like search engines, plus $5 to access like news, plus $5 to access a couple of other websites, plus $10 to watch video, and then you get your social network for free. So that's the whole idea behind the concept of net neutrality. It is pretty much enforced in the legislation in Brazil. I'll go through the provisions. And then my last topic is free speech. And in terms of free speech, I would like to, yes, I know I'm quite over my time. So just to tell this one case that was quite important in Brazil, we had this case in which a very famous Brazilian actress was caught in a very intimate video that was distributed online, and just because of that, YouTube was blocked in Brazil for 2 days by a judicial decision that said that if YouTube is not able to block this video, YouTube should be blocked from Brazil as a whole. And because of this judicial decision, there was a huge commotion, and the Marco Civil treated this specific subject very clearly when the Bill of Law in Brazil said that provider will not be held liable simply because it received a notification and end up failing to comply with this notification. So the standard for liability in Brazil would be if the provider does not comply with a judicial order, it will be liable. So you might say, and I can leave that for the part of the answers and the questions here in the panel. What happened in Brazil is the idea that if you held the intermediary liable just because it received a notification and fails to comply with it, you create an industry of notifications and certainly will affect innovation and diversity on the internet. There are two exceptions for this rule in the legislation, which is copyright and revenge pornography. But I can go through that later on. So just to conclude, on the future, I would like to say that this piece of law is the very first one in Brazil that was created through a collaborative process in which we use the internet to get feedback and input for the creation of the law. So how it will impact future legislative pieces that are created in Brazil is something that it's yet to see, but it's really clear by now that Marco Civil was really important to get the expertise of people that could not afford to get a plane and to go to Brasilia, to our capital, to participate in public hearings. So what the internet is doing is really open up public hearings to get everyone to contribute and to participate in this process. But I really have to say, Marco Civil was still a very handcrafted process. At the time, we didn't have the tools to analyze all comments and to try to create a methodology on how you get the feedback from this whole community and tell people why your comment was accepted, why your comment was not accepted, why your comment was inserted into law, why your comment was not inserted into law. So there's still improvement to make in this process. It was a multi-stakeholder practice, even though we created a hard law, which is something that connects to the new presentation, and we could work on that later on. And to finish, I would just like to say that the Marco Civil has this very paradoxical task, which is to be conservative and revolutionary at the same time. So the idea is to conserve the values of the internet and at the same point allow room for innovation, for revolutions on the internet. So that's it. Thank you for that.